Good morning, everybody. Ohayou gozaimasu. My name is Demetri Sevastopulo. I'm the US-China correspondent with the Financial Times. Thank you to everyone for coming. I would like to introduce this excellent panel who are going to explain to you everything about Donald Trump. And when you leave here in an hour's time or 2 hours' time, you will have no questions. You will understand everything. Let me start off by saying on my left is Kellyanne Shaw. And Kellyanne is a trade lawyer. She's a partner at the firm of Akin, Gump. And she was a senior trade advisor to President Trump in his first administration. And I think she's one of the busiest policy trade lawyers in Washington right now. On her left is Jim Steinberg, who is the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins and former Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Then we have Tanaka sensei, who is the president of the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And finally, Victor Cha, who is president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and the Korea chair at CSIS and a former senior White House official in the George W. Bush administration. So thank you to everyone. At the end of the panel, we're going to try and have about 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So please have a think. Don't be too shy. Ask whatever you like. But with that, I'm going to kick off. Kellyanne, I'm going to start with you. The topic of our panel is how has Donald Trump 2.0, the second Trump administration, changed the Indo-Pacific? So I'd like to start and ask you, how do you think he's changed the Indo-Pacific from the perspective of trade relations with US allies and partners in the region?
Well, thank you so much for hosting us here. It is great to be here. I think Demetri is right. I am very sleep deprived these days, as are probably many of you, trying to navigate the new world and the new global trading system that we're watching quite literally unfold in real time. And so we were talking about this on the way over here, the fact that this could be a very short conversation because we are about to see what the president's strategy is for the Indo-Pacific as part of his broader trip to Asia. And so there are some questions that I think will be answered in the coming days as we see how his meetings go in Malaysia, Japan, and Korea as well. But just observing where things are now and maybe where they're a bit distinct from the first Trump administration. I think in Trump 1.0, which is the one that I worked in, it was about redefining the Asia-Pacific as the Indo-Pacific, meaning an Asian and United States partnership that did not include China, but included everyone else plus India. That was effectively the model for security reasons, for economic reasons, and other reasons. And our administration pursued this through things like the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. We had the Quad. We had plans to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative through infrastructure development. There was a Blue Dot Initiative and many other attempts. And then we had trade. And you might sort of question that as a talking point when it comes to the first Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, because the very first thing the Trump administration did was withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. withdrew, there was still an interest in trading and improving the balance of trade with so many partners. And so we had renegotiated a deal with Japan, this sort of phase one deal. We took on China in terms of that massive phase one deal that the president is now looking to renegotiate in a second administration. And we started looking at many of our other relationships from broader perspectives, not just the traditional trade sense, but also in an investment sense. And again, there was this emphasis on investing, on growing these relationships, but fully recognizing that the paradigm for trade that we had proceeded on for the past 20 years just didn't work anymore, and that runway ran out. So fast forwarding to Trump 2.0 and what this means, you're seeing even more of an emphasis on rebalancing these relationships. As a matter of fact, the president has renegotiated the tariff rates with every single country in the world simultaneously. And what we're seeing for most of the Asian trading partners is a tariff rate of somewhere between 15 to 20%. And there are some deviations there, but it is effectively the idea that we need to shift some of these trading relationships for national security reasons as well as for economic economic ones. And then you're seeing the administration take on China in a very renewed way. And we'll, of course, see how the Trump-Xi meeting goes later this week. But I do think the jury is out. And that's sort of why I had a very long wind-up to answer Demetri's very specific question, which is that we'll have to see exactly how all of this plays out. We are only 9 or 10 months into the second administration. There has been so much activity. It will be several more years before we really see how this evolves. But these supply chains are going to be increasingly important with our Asian trading partners outside of China. And I think that there are some other things that are going to happen beyond just the tariffs that will make it more difficult to have a robust trading relationship with China, which leaves a real big opportunity for the Indo-Pacific and other trading partners. And so I expect to see several deals announced this week. And again, this story is just beginning. We're only on chapter 1 or 2 of what is going to be a pretty profound shift in these relationships.
It feels like about chapter 10 to me already, but you're right, it's only chapter 1 or chapter 2. Jim, in the broader sense, how has Trump changed the Indo-Pacific from the kind of collective perspective allies? Is the jury still out there, or after 9 months, how do you see it?
Thanks, Demetri, and let me join Dr. Hamre in thanking our hosts from Nikkei and for all of you for being here. It's like John, this is something I look forward to every year, and it's really a pleasure to be a part of this and to watch the evolution of this partnership over many years now, and this conversation, which is so valuable to all of us. You know, I think when we met a year ago, when we've met in past years, there were two settled truths, I think, by this time last year about the approach of the United States to the Indo-Pacific. The first was that, and these were shared truths, they were bipartisan truths, they were consensus truths, that one, that the US and China were in a long-term strategic competition, approaching potentially even a rivalry for the future of the region, and there was a contest for who was going to be and how this region was going to be organized, with the contest focusing on the relationship between the United States and China. But the second truth was that in that competition or rivalry, that the United States allies were both central to our ability to prevail in that competition over the long term, and that they were necessary partners in our strategic advantage dealing with China. The old meme that the United States has, you know, an extraordinary large number of partners, allies, and friends in the Indo-Pacific and around the world, whereas China basically has few, if any, maybe North Korea. And both of those settled truths have been challenged over the last 10 months. We are seeing a huge amount of uncertainty about how President Trump sees the relationship with China, and whether he shares the view that this is a long-term strategic competition, or whether he has a different kind of conception about how the United States and China work together. It's particularly confused by the way he talks about President Xi, which is something that very few other American political leaders would do, given all the challenges that President Xi and his leadership has presented to the United States and its partners and allies, and the rather kind of weaving way in which the engagement with China has proceeded, both from some very strong measures, including on the trade side with the tariffs and actions that have taken on the technology side, but then seeing, you know, in a matter of days, hours, minutes, you know, flipping around to different approaches. And so as we've seen, for example, on the export controls, you know, at one moment, the United States taking very strong measures to toughen even what had taken place under the Biden administration, and then the decision to allow NVIDIA and others to sell chips to China. And so while it's not clear, and I think I agree with Kellyanne, we don't know where this is really going, the one thing for sure is that it's not for sure, right? And which is something one would have assumed, and as Kellyanne said, I mean, in the first Trump administration, was sort of at the heart of the Trump administration's national security strategy, was seeing China and Russia as the sort of the strategic frame of competition. It's just not clear whether the president shares that. And then on the second leg, with respect to the allies, there's just a fundamental question about whether Trump believes that the United States has a deep strategic interest in the partnership with the allies. There are leaders in the administration who've been reaffirming some of those messages. We saw from Secretary of Defense Hegseth's comments at Shangri-La that he seemed to echo rather traditional American views about the fundamental importance. And yet we also see in the relationship with friends and allies the sort of a sense in which which the transactional relationships with our partners are all that matters, and that friends are treated at least no better and sometimes worse than adversaries. And I think what's particularly concerning, and I hear this both from our friends in the region as well as those of us who care about these partnerships in the United States, is that we're seeing the use of coercive tactics against allies in ways which are really close to unprecedented. And we've had challenges before. Everybody who's as old as I and some of us here remember back into the days of the 90s and US-Japan relations and some of the tensions there. But at no point did you see the sort of idea that we were going to use threats of economic pressure at the level that we have seen throughout the region in dealing with our partners, and no sense that the deeper, broader strategic importance of these relationships in any way influences how we engage with these partners on individual issues. Now, there's no question that approach, this fairly coercive approach, has generated benefits. The administration has reached agreements with partners, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but within Europe and in North America as well, in getting new deals and the like. But the question is, over time, whether approaching it in this way and using these kinds of coercive techniques undermine the kind of fundamental strategic understanding that have underpinned the U.S. engagement and the nature of our partnerships here. I mean, Dr. Hamre in his opening remarks remarked about the maturation of the U.S.-Japan relationship and the sense that we really are partners in some respects. But I don't see a lot of that in the way in which either Japan or others have been engaged. And so the question is whether, in the long run, this will lead to some fundamental rethinking in the Asia-Pacific region about the fundamental reliability of the partnership here. I mean, because the problem that the allies face is that what we've seen is this whole issue about dependence and decoupling being used against allies. That is, because the allies are dependent on the United States, both economically and for security, allies are very vulnerable to these kinds of approaches that the administration has used and don't have a lot of options in the short term. But the question is, if this leverage continues to be used by the United States against our friends, the question is whether partners, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in other regions as well, will feel the need to sort of reduce their dependence on the United States so as to be less at risk to these kinds of approaches. And I think that's really the big challenge for the region going forward.
So if I was to sum up what both of you have said, I think if Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary, was here, he would have said we've got a lot of known unknowns and maybe a few unknown unknowns. Tanaka-sensei, how does what Trump is doing in the Indo-Pacific look like from the perspective of Japan? And we're going to talk a little bit later on about the new government and the new prime minister, but just broadly speaking, how does Japan see the changes over the last 9 months?
Well, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to join this panel. I'm particularly happy that the concept of Indo-Pacific is so prevalent. Particularly happy because I have been arguing for the importance of this concept over the past 10 years or so. And in my understanding, the importance of the Indo-Pacific does not change. It remains crucial. It continues to be the center of economic dynamism in the world, and it is the theater of geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And so both economic sense and geopolitical sense, the importance of the Indo-Pacific has not reduced. And this was quite, I think, confirmed by the big international conference Japan organized last August called TICAD, Tokyo International Conference for African Development, where quite a significant number of heads of government from Africa came to Yokohama and then engaged in serious conversation in how to develop economic dynamism in Africa. But then during that conversation, there is an increasing sense of connecting Africa to the Indian Ocean countries. And then it used to be called that Japanese private sector was rather reluctant to go to Africa. But the last TICAD meeting indicated that quite a significant significant number of Japanese business have shown in investing in Africa, increasing trade relations there. And then quite significantly, the quite number of very good Japanese business companies stationed in India try to increase their trade with Africa. And so the connection around the Indian Ocean and to the Asia-Pacific region is, it seems to me, expanding. And with respect to U.S. involvement in the Indo-Pacific region, I firstly express my appreciation to President Trump for visiting this region of the world in this weekend. And he is to not just to come to Japan, but before coming here, he is to go to Malaysia. And then after Japan, he went to South Korea. And I think the length of the U.S. president's stay in both Southeast Asia and East Asia is quite significant. And also, I'm very appreciative of President Trump in his interest in mediating conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. And we are told that Thai and Cambodia will sign a peace accord in front of Mr. Trump in next Sunday. And so this indicates the American involvement in the Indo-Pacific. And then in terms of security relations, I believe we have to recognize the importance of increasing ties amongst American allies. Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, Japan. I think, previously there are times when Japanese and Koreans are not going very well in terms of security relations, but now we have very good relations, and so U.S. allies in this region is doing very well and welcome American engagement. However, in my understanding, there are certain areas that we would like the U.S. or the President Trump administration to do more or to clarify. First is these issues of, I think that's Jim mentioned, that the transactional approaches in reciprocal tariff. And no discrimination among the countries. And, most of the countries, whether allies or friends or not, they are imposed on transactional, reciprocal tariffs. This, I think, somehow creates tensions. And then, secondly, I see no clear vision in the area of economic regionalism or economic relations between the U.S. and the Indo-Pacific after the demise of the USAID. I think the quite number of countries, particularly in Africa, many countries dependent on the USAID for the humanitarian assistance and others, and they are gone now. And so reciprocal tariff plus the demise of the USAID or US ODA seem to imply that America is not interested in economic affairs in the Indo-Pacific, which I think, in my understanding, should be rectified because of the reason that I just mentioned, because this region continues to be the center of economic dynamism, and so it should be in the U.S. interest to have footholds in those regions. And so we don't know how the Trump 2.0 will evolve now, but I hope that the longer view, paying attention to economic dynamism may be needed. I believe geostrategic relations, as I said, the Pentagon and the US allies are doing very well. But in order to maximize the benefits, I think the US, I would like it to pay more attention to economic aspect of the Indo-Pacific.
Great, thank you very much. Victor, I'd just like to say about Victor, a number of years ago, he wrote an excellent book on North Korea. I think the title is The Impossible State. It's about this thick, but it's really good. So anyone who can write a book this thick on the most opaque country in the world, analyzing Donald Trump should be simple, right? So how does South Korea, Victor, look at what's happening in the Indo-Pacific and what Donald Trump is trying to do?
Well, thanks, Demetri, for the question. And I, too, want to say thank you to CSIS and Nikkei for having me here at the 22nd Forum and to be here on the stage with my distinguished colleagues. I'm someone who has, for 3 decades, studied the U.S. alliance system in Asia and then was an alliance manager at one point in a previous U.S. administration. I have thought long and hard about what is fundamentally different about the way President Trump looks at allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. And I think, to me, the best way to sum this up is to, when Trump was elected a second time, we collected data at CSIS for all European and Asian allies in terms of 2 data points. One was the trade balance, merchandise trade balance with the United States, and the other was defense spending as a percentage of GDP. And in all of these cases, except for 2, every US ally and partner ran a trade surplus with the United States and was spending less than 3% of GDP, 3% of GDP on national defense. And I think the difference between past US foreign policy and President Trump is that past US policymakers would look at those things, right? Perennial trade deficits, sort of lower cost sharing on the defense side. And there might be occasional tensions that arise out of that, but in the net, the assessment was that these bargains are still worth doing because these are countries that share common values with the United States. They are important security partners. They are important trade partners. And in the net, these are extensions of US power, right? Despite some of the deficiencies that one might see in these relationships. I think for President Trump, the net assessment is to focus much more on those very specific metrics and those transactional elements. The fact that every country does run a trade surplus with the United States, every major US ally, which the president sees as cheating, in quotation marks. And then on the security side, that the fact that they don't spend as much on defense means that they are free riding off of US security commitments. So on balance, I think, while past US administrations might have seen the bargain that is inherent in these relationships, there are costs and benefits. The difference from President Trump, he takes a very literal approach, looking at specifically these metrics and seeing them as not to the US favor. My second point is that in spite of all this, what we've seen, particularly on the reciprocal tariff sides, because that's been the most obvious and prominent element, as Kellyanne said, of the policy when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, most allies, including South Korea, Japan, as well as European allies, in the beginning may have wanted to say they're not going to bend the knee to US pressure, but in the end, they all seem to accommodate. They all seem to look to try to make a deal with the US president In Japan's case, we know well the trade deal and the $550 billion investment agreement. In Korea's case, a $350 billion investment deal that, frankly, the Koreans really can't afford. It's just too much. So the question to me is why? Like, why have all these countries, whether we're talking about Canada, the EU, Japan, South Korea, why have they all agreed to make a deal with Trump? And I think that there are basically three reasons for this. The first, of course, is the immediate need to reduce the tariff, right? This is a heavy tariff burden, whether we're talking about reciprocal tariffs, auto parts tariffs, steel and aluminum tariffs. These are very heavy burdens. And so the initial impetus is, of course, you want to reduce the tariff burden. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, these changes in US policy are happening in a very unforgiving external environment for Japan, South Korea, European allies, and others. And when I say an unforgiving external environment, I'm talking about not just the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, but the military actions in Venezuela, in Iran, all of these things starting to really erode the notion that there is an international norm against the use of force, something that Japan values very much. An international norm against the use of force looks like it's being eroded by both the wars and actions that we're seeing by great powers. In addition to that, the US-China competition, which we've just discussed, really has reduced the hedge space for allies and partners like Japan, South Korea, and Europe. The notion that you could have an economic partner in China and a security partner in the United States, and that countries could play both of those games, that I think is becoming harder and harder for countries to do. And then third, adding to this very unforgiving external environment is the weaponization of trade. Right? The two lead powers in the international system today, the United States and China, are actively weaponizing trade that is so important to the Indo-Pacific. And then the third reason I think that Indo-Pacific partners, including South Korea, Japan, and others, are willing to make deals with the United States is because I think that America First, right? The America First policies, when it applies to alliances, is essentially signaling to allies that allies now must manage the custodial burden of the alliance. In other words, it's the allies that must invest in the long term to try to maintain the long-term resiliency of these alliance relationships, not allow them to erode in the current period. And for this reason, they are taking on the burden, willing to make the deals with Trump because they want the relationship to continue, certainly during 3 years of Trump, but even after Trump. They don't want to lose that. And so I think America First has really put the custodial burden of managing alliances onto the allies themselves. The last point, Demetri, that I'll make, and this is the case for South Korea and others, and I think Tanaka-sensei and Jim and Kellyanne have mentioned this, is that this exercise of US power that we're seeing now thus far has been successful from a US perspective in that many of these allies and partners have agreed to make deals with the United States. But whether that is going to be the sort of continuing dynamic going forward is very unclear. We just completed a major study at CSIS looking how allies and partners around the world are responding to the new US foreign policy. And they all are trying to make deals with the administration. But we also saw that many of them are quietly thinking about plan Bs, contingency plans. They are not acting on those plans yet, but they are actively thinking about them. And so I think the future is quite unpredictable, even though this initial exercise of US power has been successful.
Thank you, Victor. Kellyanne, just to kind of pick up on some of the things that you said and others, and Victor just talked about the weaponization of trade. So we have had an incredible 9 months in terms of trade actions, coercive actions in some cases. And yet the stock market in Japan is at a record high. My pension is up 30% since Donald Trump came to power. Has the disruption in the trade space actually been less than we think it is? Or am I deluding myself?
So maybe I'll start. I realize this is a a discussion on international relations and not on physics, but there is this concept in quantum physics called superposition, where particles can be all things and in all states at the same time. And I think that that is a very good analogy for trying to understand both the president as well as the Trump administration. And when it comes to trade, the administration has bucked all orthodoxy. To your point, not just the stock market in Japan, but also the US is at an all-time high. The economy is doing really well. And there's some numbers on jobs and housing which could use a bit of a boost, but every other economic factor is showing great strength. And we have not seen the signs of price increases as a result of tariffs or inflation. I think that most in Washington expect that at some point that will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And we'll see. We'll see how this plays out. But what that means politically is that the longer the US economy holds, the longer the leash the president has to take these more aggressive steps on trade, including these tariffs and other types of actions that, for all accounts and purposes, everyone thought would just totally destabilize the global trading system, and they haven't. Now, again, going back to my first comment, we're on chapter 2 of the Trump administration, and really, this is a once-in-a-generation moment for not just the global trading system, but the global financial system, global alliances. I think we are going through some pretty seismic shifts, and we're going to have to see how all of them evolve before we can assess what this moment in time really meant. So that's sort of part of it as well. But I do think sort of all these things are true at the same time. We are confronting China, we are de-risking. In some sectors, we're also decoupling. The president is very relational. He's also very transactional. He is prioritizing hard power over soft power, but he's also a president who's pursuing peace. And so he's this method in contradiction, and part of it is he thinks like a negotiator. And part of being a good negotiator is throwing off the person sitting on the other side of the table from you, and in some cases that's the other country, and sometimes that's your competitor, and sometimes it's your ally. But he really is bucking the convention.
Jim, you know, people talk about, and you talked as well about the kind of coercive campaign that Donald Trump is running with allies. But if you look at Europe, for example, and I say this as a European, he's actually the first president who really has made the European allies boost defense spending. Yes, it was done in an uncomfortable way. The question is there a benefit to the way he does things, or do you think that that approach, as you kind of hinted at, over time, that kind of coercive diplomacy, in the short term it might achieve benefits, but in the long term alliances will be weaker? But is there a case to be made that his approach is not as coercive as it might seem on the surface?
I mean, it's a great question, Demetri, and I do think in this respect there's a difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, at least as we're seeing it. I think in the first round, Trump also made an issue with Europeans about increasing defense spending, and he got increases. But it was done in the context of the expectation that if allies did this, it would re-strengthen NATO, it would re-strengthen the US commitment to NATO, and that we would continue to be involved, that the Europeans needed to show up, but that we were still. I think what's happened in round 2 is, yes, the Europeans have done it, and for a lot of the reasons that Victor said, but also because Europe is now considering the possibility that Europe may be on its own. And so the motivation to do it is no longer just to propitiate Trump, but actually to think about what it's going to be like if Europe has to support Ukraine by itself, if Europe has to confront Russia by itself. And what you're seeing is this sort of nascent development of a kind of a new set of compacts, almost back to the old days of the West European Union in the early 1950s, where even Britain, outside of the EU, but sort of in this kind of coalition of the willing, are starting to think about new structures of security engagement. And so the motivation now is as much, we need to do this because we may not have the United States anymore, and the reliability. Whereas I think in the first term there was a sense, well, if we do what Trump asks in burden sharing, then the U.S. will recommit itself to the partnership. But again, I mean, the problem with President Trump is it's just hard to know, right? I mean, there are times in which he raises doubts about his commitment to Article 5 and sort of suggests, well, it's something we will decide in the individual case, and we don't feel it's a long-term commitment. Other times you get a different story. But I think it feels different to me, and when you talk to Europeans, as I know you do, I mean, a lot of their motivation is to say, well, in the first best case, we'll do this and hope that means the U.S. will stay and be engaged, but now we're doing it as much as a hedge against the U.S. not staying.
Tanaka-sensei, a few months ago, there was kind of unprecedented thing happened when the Japanese cancelled what's called a 2+2, a foreign and defense ministers meeting where the Japanese and the Americans meet in Washington. There was a lot of tension where some people in the Pentagon were putting pressure on Japan to spend even more on defense than had been talked about before. It felt a little bit rocky after several years of relations really becoming even stronger. Do you think things are back in a better place right now?
Well, I think with the new administration in Japan now installed, I believe the alliance relations between Japan and the United States is, in my understanding, on track. And then, well, it's partly because of the new prime minister, who is very keen on maintaining and improving relations with the United States. But secondly, in my understanding, there is a growing consensus on security issues in the Japanese the parliament. You know, LDP doesn't hold the majority, but then quite a number of opposition parties, and now ruling coalition partner Ishin and then National Democrats, they generally share the similar view with respect to security policy. And so I believe despite the sort of fragility and weakness of the Liberal Democratic Party in the parliamentary politics, I am fairly certain that the security relations with the United States will be maintained and even improved. As you know, this afternoon, Prime Minister Takaichi will deliver her first policy speech, in which it is reported that she will announce the preparation to revise the national security strategy, and also she may indicate that her government will accelerate the process of increasing defense budget much earlier pace.
Victor, can I ask you, one of the achievements of the Biden administration was the Camp David Accord, where you had the US, the Japanese, and the South Koreans meeting, and really strengthening that trilateral relationship as a kind of a counter to China. Do you have a sense at this point, or is it too early to say whether that is going to be resurrected? President Trump, new president in Korea, and now a new prime minister in Japan. What's your outlook for that?
I certainly hope it is going to be something that continues. It is, to me, there's sort of two strategic triangles that are critical to stability in Asia. One of them is the US, Japan, South Korea triangle in terms of whether you're talking about security or economic security or supply chains, this is critical. And then the other is the US, Japan, China triangle, that there needs to be, whenever there is stability in these two triangles, Asia is stable, right? Whether it will continue, I think from my sense from the Trump administration is that while the Biden administration did a lot of work in this area, and of course, as you mentioned, Camp David was sort of the high point of it, the creation of this commitment to consult, which is the closest thing historically to a collective defense commitment among the three countries. The commitment to meet every year as a trilateral, leaders trilateral, something that did not exist beforehand. It's extraordinary if you think about it. Historically, Japan and Korea are our two closest allies in Asia. And anytime the three leaders met, it was by definition ad hoc, because it wasn't embedded in any institution. So all these things are very important. My sense is that the Trump administration, President Trump, is still supportive of this trilateral because they feel that they did a lot of work on the trilateral and Trump won. And that there is a through line, therefore, between Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2. Whether you agree or disagree with that particular point, it's a good thing for trilateral relations. But of course, it takes more than just one party. There were concerns with the leadership change in South Korea, the very abrupt leadership change in South Korea, whether the opposition party which came to power under the President Lee would be supportive of trilateral relations. I think there was a lot of concern about whether that would be the case. And thus far, President Lee has been supportive of it. The first trip he made, even before coming to Washington in August of this past summer, was to Tokyo to meet the Japanese Prime Minister. And I think there's now concern with the new Japanese Prime Minister whether she will be supportive of it, in part because there were statements, views in the past that believe she might be less inclined. But again, I think with many politicians, what they say as they rise to power and once they take power can be somewhat different, and that they, in general, tack more towards the middle. And I think there's a positive signal there. But I mean, these leadership factors are important, but I again want to reemphasize how for all three countries, there is an external security environment that would compel leaders, regardless of who they are, to be pressing for better trilateral cooperation. And I've already mentioned some of them in my initial comments, but of course, the other one that all of us are aware about, but we haven't brought it up yet in this particular grouping, is the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea growing axis of autocracies. These things create fundamental impulses for these three governments, regardless of who's in the leadership, to want to work together more.
So I have a simple question for all four of you. Let's say this afternoon you get a call from the Kante, and the new Prime Minister says, we have this distinguished panel, I want them each to come in for 5 minutes and give me one piece of advice for dealing with Donald Trump ahead of his visit on Monday. Jim, you smile, so I'm going to go to you first. What would your one piece of advice be to Prime Minister Takaichi?
Find another airplane to give to the president. I mean, I think that I think it is important, and we've seen that the president expects the leaders that he meets with to show real appreciation for what the United States does and has done. And that's entirely appropriate. I mean, I think it is important to understand that the U.S. has made important commitments and sacrifices over the years. But I think, what needs to happen and when it's been most successful, I mean, there's sort of been interesting relationships. I think the most interesting one to watch has been the relationship between President Trump and the President of Mexico, right? Which, because she's a woman, maybe that's a particularly good model for the Prime Minister to do, which is that she has managed to both be respectful of the president and respectful of why the president is pushing for the things and the concerns that he's trying to achieve, while making clear that the interests have to be mutual, right? That this is not just going to be a one-way kind of proposition. And when you listen to President Trump talk about the president of Mexico, he has been positive about the times in which she's pushed back as well as the times in which she's agreed. And I think finding that space is really the key, which is to reflect the president's strong sense that there hasn't been enough appreciation of the United States and that it needs to be done without being a sycophant. And I think that is the place which I would hope, and this may be, I don't know whether it's good advice or not, but if I were in this position, I would be there to say, look, we get this, and we understand why you think we need to do these things, deal with the trade issues, deal with the burden sharing issues on security, but understand, where we're coming from to what we need to address. And I do think there's some evidence that when dealt with in that way, there is some resonance from President Trump.
Does anyone else want to give any advice to the new Prime Minister? Or? No? Tanaka-san?
Well, I think I would like to ask Ms. Takaichi to emulate what Prime Minister Abe did, to persuade Mr. Trump that maintaining U.S.-Japan economic as well as security relations is the best way to achieve Make America Great Again.
I'm going to, sorry, Victor, did you want to?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think, I agree entirely with what Aki just said. I think the other thing is, I think many, again, when we looked at this, many of the leaders around the world are uncomfortable in a sense that they are going against their basic policy instincts, right? If the policy instinct is to have serious conversations about substantive issues, air disagreements, maybe not publicly, but privately, what most leaders have done is exactly the opposite, which is to flatter, never to disagree, certainly not in public, and to focus deliverables more on the optics and worry about the substance later. And so I think for any leader coming into office, this feels very alien, right? But it's what many have done to and then the second point is the one I think Jim made, which is to really focus on agreements that, and to keep reiterating that there are win-win, there are positive sum solutions, that not everything is zero sum, where there's a winner and a loser, especially with the allies. There are positive sum solutions where we're both doing better, and to identify those sweet spots is the key.
Kellyanne, I want to fast forward to next week. On Thursday, Donald Trump is going to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea. His Treasury Secretary and his Chinese counterpart are meeting in Malaysia to talk about trade over the next 3 days to try and resolve some of the tensions that have escalated recently. What do you expect is going to come out from the Trump-Xi Jinping meeting in terms of any kind of a trade-related deal? What's the best case scenario, and what do you think is the worst case scenario?
No, maybe I'll start with that. I was about to say, if I knew what was going to come out, I would be a very wealthy woman. Right, I think there's sort of a choose-your-own-adventure menu of options that could come out. And I think sort of best-case scenario would be something like what Ambassador Greer and Secretary Bessent previewed just last week, which is some sort of pause. China agrees to pause its rare earth export restrictions and not implement them for a period of time. And the U.S. takes a pause on implementing those 100% tariffs and its own potential export controls on exports to China. And then coupled with maybe a purchasing commitment on soybeans and sorghum and maybe a few other commoditized products. That would be like the best case scenario in my view. Worst case scenario, this relationship completely falls off a cliff and things spiral to a place that is going to be very hard to dig back out of. And I am actually very concerned about this relationship right now. I think that the president has been very positive in his remarks. He's giving President Xi and the Chinese a very long leash to de-escalate from those rare earth export controls, saying we think, we'll probably get a deal, it's going to be okay, we think it's going to be okay. But I will say, if you listen to his other advisors and behind the scenes, there is a tremendous amount of concern in Washington about these rare earth export controls and China's very aggressive move to take control of the entire global technology supply chain. And that is a paradigm that cannot stand. And so I think that these two leaders are going to have to find their way through this. What I'm not expecting is some grand phase 2 deal to come out of these talks. I don't think that's on the table. I do think this is about managing the relationship where it's at as opposed to really advancing it. And so this is a delicate dance with the world's two largest economies, two superpowers, two nuclear powers. There's a lot to watch in the next few days.
So I'm going to open up the floor to questions in a second, but first I'm just going to take a question that's come in online from Albert in Singapore, because it's better than the question that I had, and Tanaka-sensei, I'm going to ask you this. And he says, how do you think the new Japanese Prime Minister will play the balancing act in Trump 2.0 of her personal inclinations that are aligned on self-defense and Taiwan relationships, along with a national desire to improve conversations or relations with China? So how will she balance the US and China, do you think?
Well, I don't believe there is, I don't know if, balance is the appropriate description about Japan's approaches to the United States and China. On the one hand, Japan has a great economic interdependence with China, and so China is a very important economic partner. But in many ways, the United States has consistently been the most important partner for Japan, an ally. And so I think although sometimes it's puzzling to observe President Trump's transactionalist approaches, particularly his transactionalist approaches to China is rather puzzling. What could emerge, we don't, really anticipate easily. And then if you look at his transactional approaches to Russia and Ukraine, and then all those series of interaction gives us some sense of puzzlement. But then, Japan and the United States, no matter who the president is, no matter who the prime minister is, Japan and the United States as two important economic powers and two security partners continue to have very, very strong national interests. And I think in order to establish great constructive relations with China, we need to have very solid alliance relations with the United States.
Well, the good news is that the new defense minister, Koizumi-san, is an alumnus of CSIS. So, John, hopefully he's well equipped for the role. Okay, over to the audience. Who would like to ask the panel a question? If you could raise your hand. The gentleman here. And if you could just tell us who you are and then who you'd like to answer the question, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Atsushi Okudera from Asahi Shimbun. My question is probably to Ms. Shao. Just you mentioned about the rare earth restriction. Yes, it is said that the rare earth is quite critical for the U.S. defense industries or the semiconductor industry or something like that. Is it the greatest weakness for the United States? And given the big independence of on China for China on electric component or daily necessities, so is the U.S. at the disadvantage in trade negotiations with China and forced to compromise? Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. I think it's a great question. What I will say is every economy has vulnerabilities, and the US and China are no exception. I think that clearly the fact that China controls 98% of the processing and refining of rare earth elements isn't just a vulnerability for the United States, it's a vulnerability for Japan, it's a vulnerability for Europe, it's a vulnerability for everyone else in the world, and I think that every country should be concerned about this. Now that said, I do think that China has its own vulnerabilities as well. And that is frankly why I am so nervous about a potential de-escalation in terms of the way that this relationship goes between President Trump and President Xi. I think neither side really wants to throw this relationship totally off a cliff because some of these vulnerabilities are so severe. But we'll have to see how all of this plays out. Thank you.
And I hope I don't get in trouble with Chairman Okada for giving the first question to the Asahi Shimbun. Who would like to ask the next question? Gentleman over here in the front? Oh, okay. And then back over there.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Iwata, Japan Center for Economic Research. I have two questions. Rare earth issue is the choke point for United States, and maybe the dialogue between Xi and Trump is one of the big issues. Under Trump 1.0, there had been, no, that was under Biden administration, I should say. IPEF was the kind of international cooperation framework in order to cope with this securing the rare earth among allied countries. And now some progress we see between United States, Canada, Australia, but do you expect any Asia-Pacific framework to reconstruct the global value chain with respect to the rare earth? This is first question. The second question is under first Trump, there had been a security strategy named the strategy of denial, prioritizing the China, the first priority China. So, and I'm hearing that they are now formulating a new security strategy. How do you find the progress of this new security strategy by the U.S.? And together with this, Trump also argued Golden Dome proposal. How do you find the progress of these two strategies?
Kellyanne, do you want to take the rare earths question?
Sure, and I think the question was also about IPEF as well, as one a way to address this vulnerability. So, the challenge with IPEF in a lot of ways is that it was a non-binding agreement with very airy-fairy-like commitments. So while directionally, it was trying to address some of the right challenges, and I think that the IPEF negotiations put their thumb on some of the things and the issues that the Indo-Pacific should be working towards addressing. It did not do so in any meaningful way. It didn't really move the needle. And so, what you're seeing is the president addressing many of these issues bilaterally at the moment. So you had Prime Minister Albanese, who was in Washington on Monday, who signed an $8.5 billion critical mineral deal with the United States, which had things like equity shares, floor pricing, and other types of measures. I think you'll see the president address some of these same issues with Malaysia and other countries during his Asia tour. We have not heard him talk about an Indo-Pacific-wide approach or an Asian approach. That's not to say that that's off the table, but I think right now the president is prioritizing source countries and partnerships individually. At some point, this will have to be stitched together, because although rare earth elements aren't rare and you can find them in many different places, certain critical minerals have very specific source countries, and there are a lot of aspects of that supply chain that will need to be knit together by different geographies. So I think this is very much, again, like that chapter 2 of a much longer story.
Victor, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something about trade, even though I know nothing about trade, which is going to sound really irresponsible. But so even if, as Kellyanne says, even if there is some sort of pause or de-escalation, my personal opinion is China's going to continue to do this. They will continue to weaponize trade. And because basically they do these things and they feel that they're very costless actions. There are no costs to doing this, really, whether it's embargoing the purchase of soybeans or whether it's going after rare earth elements. But I want to reiterate what Kellyanne said, which is that China has vulnerabilities too. I mean, we've identified, even in the critical mineral space, that China has vulnerabilities in certain elements. That trading partners like the United States, Japan, and others have leverage on. And on the other than critical minerals, on the merchandise trade side, there are like over 600 things that China is highly dependent on. The very countries that it has coerced, it's very dependent on. So this is where perhaps Donald Trump's style may be useful, because there needs to be some way of demonstrating to China that others have leverage too, that if they do these things, they are not cost-free. And I think in one sense, rather than going around and tariffing all of our allies and partners, we should be pulling them together to come with some sort of collective message to China on the costs of coercion.
Jim, do you want to say something?
Yeah, so I maybe take the Golden Dome and the national security strategy part of the question, because I think it's a really important question. I mean, I do think, first of all, there have been a lot of rumors about the new national defense strategy, but it hasn't come out yet. And I've learned over the years that you should, just because Politico reported it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. That may be. So I think we need to wait until we see what the administration actually says. But I do think the Golden Dome issue raises a fundamental question here, because this is one of these things that could be glass half full, glass half empty. On the one hand, you could say, well, if the United States has more effective defenses, it makes it more effective in extending deterrence to others, because it doesn't have, it's less vulnerable to the idea that we're, sacrificing Los Angeles for Tokyo or Berlin for, or New York for Berlin or whatever. So that's the good news story. I mean, if we have some more defense against that. The bad news story is if this is part of a kind of, we're going to protect ourselves, we've got oceans and now we've got the sky to protect us, so we don't need to worry about others as much. And that's always been the tension, and that's why we ended up, with the ABM treaty in the past and the like. And I do think that there is a serious risk here, and particularly in the nuclear dimension, that we are valuing nuclear weapons as a part of strategy rather than as a kind of residual way of defending against last resorts. And a lot of the talk about nuclear strategy on our side and watching the modernization on the Chinese side should worry us all. I mean, because we don't have any significant strategic dialogue going on about any of these things. And it was bad before, and it's much worse with AI and some of the other technologies, which makes this potentially even more stable. So, and we're not hearing any discussion about those things. So I think taken by itself, the Golden Dome could be potentially an important and valuable part of the strategy, but it needs to be integrated into a broader recognition about the whole set of issues which have always been a concern about strategic stability, and now potentially even more so when it's no longer just a bilateral competition between the United States and China, the United States and the Soviet Union, where we no longer have any frameworks for these things, and a whole set of new uncertainties about both the new nuclear technologies, AI, and some of the near-nuclear technologies like hypersonics and the like.
I think we have time for one more question. I think a gentleman over there, did you have a question? Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your time. Shinsuke Hirose with JP Morgan. With regards to the investment deals, I had basically a two-part question. Victor Cha, you mentioned that for South Korea, there are significant obstacles to pursuing the deal, and I just wanted to get a little bit more detail from you about what you see as the main obstacles about if that fundamentally centers around FX markets, access to liquidity. And second, from a more medium and long-term perspective, I'd be very interested to hear Ms. Shaw, Ms. Steinberg, Tanaka-san, your views about how the medium-term effects of these relationships, with the Japan example having preferred supplier or preferred vendor agreements, how that fundamentally affects the trade deficit. And in the long term, if that affects allies' ability to pursue Plan B type relationships. All this investment has to come from somewhere, and if it's going towards the United States, it's not going towards many of these projects that may have been to indigenize certain capabilities. And so we'd very much appreciate your thoughts about how that affects the nature of some of these long-term plans and alliance structures or relations with the United States.
Victor, do you want to take the obstacles to the investment from the Korean perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to, but I don't think I can tell you anything you haven't already read in the open press, which is that, the $350 billion was agreed to by South Korea. I don't know if they knew at the time they couldn't afford it, but they really realized certainly after August 25th, after President Lee's trip to Washington, D.C., that it was just more than they could handle. I know for Japan it's $550 billion. But $350 billion is 84% of South Korea's foreign exchange reserves. And I think the impediments have been largely to do with how you structure that investment deal, how much of it is cash versus loan guarantees, over what period of time. Are we talking about all cash up front, or is it spaced out over 5 years or 10 years or whatever it might be? Profit sharing, of course, is another aspect of it. Japan had worked out a particular arrangement, a 50-50 up until loan recoupment, and then a different percentage. The Koreans, I think, are trying to work that out with the United States. And then also the investments. The original incarnation of the agreement, which was a framework, basically said that the United States would have sole control over where and how and when it would invest. And I think on the South Korean side, they'd like to see some bilateral discussion about that, because there are U.S. companies that are partnered with Korean companies in areas that do well for both the United States and Korea, shipbuilding, energy, these other sorts of areas where there could be win-win solutions. So I think they're feverishly trying to work out these details in advance of President Trump's trip to Korea. When is it? Next Wednesday. By next Wednesday, they're trying to feverishly work out the details. Whether they get to all of them or not, it's not clear. I think when President Lee came to Washington August 25th, many people thought in advance of that there would be a lot of difficulties to work out on the security side with regard to North Korea and China. Dr. Hamre hosted President Lee after his White House stay at CSIS, and we found that the security side, they had actually worked out a lot of things, and that what was holding up a joint statement was the terms of the trade and investment framework deal. And so there was no joint statement out of August 25th, and hopefully they'll get something done by next Wednesday.
We're just about out of time. Kellyanne, very quickly, do you want to take the preferred supplier question, impact on trade deficits, et cetera?
Sure, and I appreciate that. I think you said you're from Morgan Stanley. JP Morgan, sorry, you're asking this question about the relationship between investment and the trade deficit. So, what I would say is there's definitely a relationship between foreign direct investment and what that means for the trade deficit, right? It sends it in the wrong direction. So I think your question is like, how did these two things square? So the $350 billion fund that we expect to be agreed with Korea and the $550 billion from Japan, that's not direct FDI. It's loan guarantees, it's financing, and in some cases just direct loans potentially. So we don't really know how that's going to impact the trade deficit per se, because it depends what that money is used for. And if it is used for the purposes that the administration intends, which is to increase production in strategic sectors, that the U.S. will be the source country, the producing country, and sell its goods elsewhere, that would actually improve the terms of trade. So I think there's a lot of unknowns in terms of how this will actually function and what the impact will be on the trade deficit. But just quickly, I would say there's sort of like there's two goals that the administration has that I think get conflated sometimes. And the first is certainly that $1.2 trillion trade deficit. That's why we impose this ring of 10 to 15% ring of tariffs on every product from every country. It has to do with the dollar being the world's reserve currency and trying to incentivize more production, notwithstanding that the FX don't adjust. But the other piece of this is that we just have vulnerabilities. There are things that in the time of the pandemic, in time of military conflict or any other force majeure event, we just need to be able to produce them in the United States, and that's irrespective of the impact of the trade deficit, and that's what those funds are being used for. So both those things are true at the same time.
So thank you very much. We have run out of time, unfortunately. If you would give a big round of applause, please, to the panel, and thank you to the audience. Thank you.
パネリストの皆様、ファシリテーターのデミトリ・セバストプロ様、ありがとうございます。
I would like to thank the panelists as well as the moderator, Mr. Demetri Sevastopulo. Once again, a round of applause for all of them. Thank you.